this is a very special series, and we're very happy that this is actually the last talk this year, and having two such wonderful people and very long-term friends in the case of Zineb here together. And it's a bit almost of a homecoming in many, many ways. So some of you know that we actually brought the exhibition of the French Pavilion here to Hamburger Bahnhof earlier last year. And now we are very happy to welcome Zineb and Sonia back to the pavilion, to Hamburger Bahnhof. Sonia was actually also in this pavilion, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. So thank you so much for being here with us today. We thought it would be very interesting to invite both of you actually to this talk as two independently working artists, but two artists that share a lot of common concerns, common wishes, common values in your practices, but also as two artists who have been living very closely together, geographically, but also closely together as friends for a very long time, sharing a lot of the same visions, hopes, struggles, artistic concerns. And I think it is probably fair to say that many parts of who you are as individuals, but also who you are as artists, are rooted in stories of immigration. And perhaps we can start with you, Zineb, on that question. You were born into a French-Algerian family in Paris, but left as a young aspiring artist early to London, and that has been your home ever since. So you said many times that you're as much French as you are British as you're Algerian. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that, what it means for your artistic practice, and what does it mean and for you as an individual, and how did it basically shape you who you are?
Okay, first of all, I was born out of Algerian parents. My parents were never, up to today, they're still not French. But obviously, me born in France, I became French. And then I came in the UK in '86. And the UK was extremely important for me in terms of my practice, because I was lucky enough to go to college, art college. I didn't do at all my art education in France, but I did it as what we called at the time as a mature student. I was already probably 28 when I went into art college. And I was lucky to do a course called Critical Fine Art Practice at the time. It didn't last that long. I think it lasted 3 years, but it was a beginning in the UK where a lot of the department of sculpture, painting, film were merging together. And that course was one of those courses that was merging together with the added thing that you had to study critical practice, but so post-colonial studies and feminist studies. I think at the time it was the only course like that, and of course it opened up to other in other university courses like that. And I was taught by amazing tutors, female tutors like Anne Talentire, Monica Ross, all that, very, very pro-feminist and very into, as I said, post-colonial also ideas. So in that sense, I was lucky to have studied at the time in the UK where those questions were very prominent. And that affected, obviously, my artwork and also my life as a woman living in the UK, becoming a mother, because all that was happening more or less at the same time, being a mother, having to think of how you transmit one identity to your children, coming from another identity. By that time I was French, Algerian, and I was British. We were speaking 3 languages amongst one family. And all that kind of influenced my work. And of course, being a mother, I think, was important, because for me, that kind of transition or transmission of language or tradition had to go through oral language, through speaking. And I use my mom and my daughter a lot in my art. This question of immigration happened through the language, really.
And what made you actually go to London? Why did you feel compelled to leave Paris and go to London at that time?
So do I have to be honest or not?
Yes, of course.
I fell in love with a man, a musician, a British musician at the time, and I ended up following him there. And it didn't last that long, so, very quickly I was on my own in London.
Well, we don't have to ask you that question because you were actually born there in London. But you can talk about who you fell in love with if you like later. But
I'm aware that this is being recorded.
Oh, it's going viral. Absolutely, yes. They're all watching. So, but perhaps you can tell us also a little bit about you born into into a certain context in London at the time, and your home, and perhaps also how was it that the two of you then met actually in London?
So yeah, I was born in London. My parents had come from the Caribbean in terms of my mum coming from Barbados and my father from South America, British Guyana, and they both met in London. So in terms of growing up, my family we were always very conscious of being, I suppose, immigrants, an immigrant family. But I was being in London, and particularly now in London, to a certain extent, people are not concerned with where you've come from. They just kind of, it's so diverse there that it's not even worth mentioning sometimes. But it wasn't like that when I was growing up. And in terms of me coming into art, the arts was not something that it's not a profession that my family were involved with. And it was only because of my teacher at school because I was always drawing, but didn't realise I was always drawing in the margins of my book, whatever the lesson was, that my art teacher wrote to my mum and said, "Oh, your daughter, she needs to go to art school." So I then started going to art school one day a week from school. I was 15 and I would travel to go to art school one day a week. But my family were like, "Oh, we don't, what is this thing? Art," and they still are actually. It's like they still say to me things like, "Oh, so people take that really seriously? I mean, how do you make it?" But it's fine because it's not the field that they're in. It's not their world, so to speak. And as part of going to art school, really at a very early age, I became part of a kind of art scene in London before I went properly to art school in terms of full time. And I'm thinking of London very much in terms of the 70s and early 80s. It was easy to squat. It was easy to become someone who got housing through a housing association. There was a lot of kind of collective and independent living that you could kind of fall into if you were in part of the art scene. And so I had, before I'd moved to Brixton, which is where Zineb and I first met, I had lived in lots of squats in different parts of London, and then eventually moved into what's called Brixton Housing Association, which is kind of cooperative housing. And this is how we met. We were both in the same housing association, but very quickly realised that, I don't know whether it's similar here, but in terms of the London kind of alternative scene, there's lots of, what's a diplomatic word?
Can we turn off the cameras for a second, please?
There'd be a very small core group of people who felt that they ran the housing association and would be the ones who decisions needed to go through. And both Zineb and I, we have children, and we weren't being offered spaces that actually could accommodate our family situation. So Zineb came to me one day and said, "Well, there's this other housing association just down the road. They have some spaces. Should we go and have a look?" And that's how we actually became neighbours. We lived next door to each other.
So it was basically through survival initially, family survival, and then the art followed. Yeah.
So maybe to take on from there, Brixton was that place and still is where you've developed a sense of home, a sense of kind of place, your families, your children, but also networks from there and beyond. I know that, Sonia, for you in the 1980s, you were very much part of the British Black movement. You met a lot of important, like Claudette Johnson, artists like Lubaina Hamid. Zineb, of course, being in different cities between Paris and London, going back to Algeria, your network also was kind of very prolific, you know, from artists your generation that are coming maybe from North African countries, but also within the UK, within France. And in a sense, I would like to try to understand how perhaps that became an important element in your work when it comes to bringing in a sense of community. Working not only as the single author of a work, or trying in a sense to give visibility or use your work as a platform for communities that perhaps have not been equally visible or heard or represented, to give them the chance to be seen. So, for instance, maybe we can start with you, Sonia, that shift that you made from self-representation in the early works to kind of more long-term projects like the devotional collection and working with communities. And then maybe I'll take the question to Zineb from there.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. So many things. You mentioned that in the 1980s, I was part of a generation that were making a lot of noise. Were very much insisting on our presence within art institutions. The Black British Arts movement of the 1980s. And what was happening in that moment was that in order for those shows to happen, we would self-organize. We initiated conversations with institutions, said we want a show, and there'd be, you know, as many of us we could get into the show, into group shows, and this is how really the movement became so well known, was because we were quite active in our own futures, you could say. So for me from the outset, I have been always part of a social group that is outwardly thinking, able to be self-organizing in many ways. And I suppose it started, I mean, particularly I'm thinking about when I was living, when I'd moved to Brixton, and I was living in shared housing, and we were all artists. We had a dark room in our house. Lots of people would come and use the dark room that was in our house. And we would, in very impromptu ways, we would get dressed up and take photos or help each other with each other's work. So the idea of a kind of social practice, although we weren't calling it that, was very, was just part of the everydayness of being in a space, particularly like Brixton, which is a very, you know, a very cultural space, has a very lively culture. And by that point, this is the late 80s and into the 90s, I realized much of my early work had been drawings, and I had been the central figure, but I was getting a lot of energy actually from working with other people, seeing that the ways that people would respond is in ways that I wouldn't have responded, and so that became the kind of germination, you could say, beginnings of me starting to work in a much more expansive way with other people.
And we'll get into this a little bit later. Maybe Zineb, you can talk to us a little bit about community in your work, and it's in a very different way that you kind of bring in the community. If I think about some of your important works over the years, whether it's talking to people that were responsible for the lighthouses in Algeria, whether it's the community as in your immediate family, the small community, whether it's talking about networks of refugees and immigration, Mauritania, you've shed light on so many stories. Perhaps the way I see you bringing community is through telling stories of these communities, whether they are physically part of making the work or not, they are in the work. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about why are you compelled to tell these stories that are not always necessarily yours directly?
I think it has to do with visibility and invisibility. And I was always attracted by stories that, first of all, I was discovering myself. You know, it could be a story, it could be a place that I didn't know of, and I discovered or fell in love with, you know, in terms of people, for example. And I would realize that, you know, not many people knew about this person, about this place, or whatever. So then that's where I kind of started researching and then make projects, whether it was a lighthouse, the Mauritanian boat graveyard, or the Algerian War of Independence, or the massacres of 1961 in France, or things like that. So then I would get people, different people to talk. Initially, it started with my family, so my family was my community. But it's very important also to understand that I also starting to do this work because I was lucky enough to hang out with Sonia and that black art community that was in Brixton. I came after, I wasn't part of it, but I came after. But they embraced me, I mean, very quickly. And I was able to develop and research those ideas, because I was coming from Paris in the 80s, and there was no discussion in France or in Paris about those questions. And there was no artist really of Algerian background or Maghrebi background doing this type of work at the time. There was movement in France called, you know, La Marche des Beurs and all that, where the French Algerian or French Maghrebis would walk in the street because of all the racism that was happening, blah, blah, blah. So there was a big question of invisibility also, but it was very, very different and very distant. In the UK, like Sonia says, and in Brixton also, it's a very militant area. You know, in your face, there was always interaction and fights with the police station, and we were living like a few minutes from the police station. There was always things going on. And that discussion with Sonia and that group of artists you mentioned earlier kind of made me want to look at and think of those stories that nobody knew about. Obviously, my interest was Algeria, because I think, especially in the UK, no one knows about Algeria because there is no colonial or imperial relationship to it. And in France, they knew about it, but didn't want to talk about it. So I felt I needed to talk, just also because my parents had suffered, you know, the Algerian war, so I needed to talk about all those stories. So unlike Sonia, it wasn't so much a community of artists, it was me on my own working with that. But of course, I was so lucky to come just after all those great, you know, conversation that happened during the Black Art movement. I benefited so much from that, just at art school, and not only, you know.
To expand on that notion of community and belonging, I mean, we've been friends for such a long time now, and even from the very first time we met, there was an immediate sense of, you know, kind of communal spirit and friendship. And I think all your collaborators, all your friends somehow end up, sometimes literally, in your installations. But I think there's such a sense of exchange and conviviality and joy, even bringing your own living room in here. And
that's more recent, I think. You know, the family moved into perhaps a community, what I call my artistic, my intellectual, or my political community, you know. So more recently, it's been about that.
And I think, Sonia, I mean, for you, community is also a very, very important thread in your artistic practice. I mean, there are so many projects that we could, I think, list in this whole thing of basically, I guess some are even recording who you are as a person and as a life and in your communities. I think it all comes together so beautifully, even, you know, giving them platforms to perform and to archive and record. I mean, you're perhaps even an artistic walking personal diary of some sorts, if I can say that. But perhaps you can maybe talk about one or two of these projects and why you feel it is important to do them, and what are you hoping to convey or to achieve by them?
Yeah, so I probably should talk about the devotional project, because that's the one that's been, there's this one image where you see placards and you see there's a wallpaper. I've been doing lots of wallpapers ever since I was a student in the late 70s, early 80s, but anyway. So the devotional project, which led into the work that was at the British Pavilion, was a project that I'd been invited by FACT, which is called the Foundation for Art and Creative Technology. They've got a new art space, which they've had now for a good 15, 20 years.
That's in Manchester.
That's in Liverpool.
Liverpool.
That's in Liverpool. But before they had their building, they had a kind of off-site program where they would match artists with specific communities to co-produce an artwork. I'd done a lot of work with in art education, museum education spaces, artist workshops, and they invited me to come and to create a work with Liverpool Black Sisters, which is a community centre, women's centre in Liverpool. And my aim was to get them. They had done a project before, which was about kind of making a work about their own biographies. And I thought, okay, so they've done some work where they're building a sense of an archive of a certain life. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to come in and maybe I could get us to do some research about women singers that they kind of, black British women singers that they'd grown up with. Because in my own practice, I was very interested in song and how song and memory works in the body. And in that very first session, there was about 8 of us. I asked the women, who were all black, whether they could name a black British female singer. And it took a really long time for anyone to think of anyone. And I think what then occurred was completely unscripted. I think the group felt really quite embarrassed that it took 10 minutes. And the first person to be remembered was Shirley Bassey, which I thought was a great start to the project. So they all went off, and I was going up to Liverpool every few weeks to develop this work. And they went and asked friends and family members and work colleagues, can you think of someone? And then very slowly, over a 3-month period, names started to trickle back to the group. And by the end of 3 months, we'd gathered about 46 names. So it was meant to be a temporary project. At the end of it, produced an artwork that was in the show, blah, blah, blah. But what then seemed to happen was that people still kept sending me names. Oh, do you remember this person? And it became a little bit like a kind of pub quiz where people would gather, sit around drinking and say, who can you know, let's add to this list. And so through friends, very informal routes, friends of friends of friends who knew I was doing this project would send me a name. And then I started to do public talks. I do a lot of public talks. And people would come to public talks with a bag and say, well, you know, I was going through my parents' in their roof and they have all these records. Would you like them? And so I then started to receive all these memorabilia. This was totally unplanned. And so this project began in 1999, and I'm still doing this project. And out of this project, and it's grown, so there's over 300 names of not just singers now, but singers and other musicians, women of colour who have made their musical career in the UK. People still send me stuff. I started to get addicted to buying records and other memorabilia, learning about all of these performers. The earliest, up until last year, the earliest entry into this kind of 300 list roll call was in the mid-19th century, but I've now got a singer who was in the 17th century who someone had kind of given me the link to find out about this performer. So people, basically, it's become a project about collective knowledge. It's not my knowledge, it's what other people kind of, and it seems to be a very addictive. So this is how the project in Venice kind of drew on that sense of just people just wanting to say, oh yeah, and of course it's connecting to their own histories.
And of course, we will get to the Venice project, both projects, in a minute. And to take it back to you, Zineb, when we talk about collective knowledge, or this question of projects that start with a specific goal and then they transform with time into something that takes years. I'm thinking a little bit about some of the early works. For instance, if, and we've shown some of these works in previous exhibitions in the past, Middle Sea, The Lovers, A View to Sea, Another Side, Remnants of a Scattered Vessel, Shattered Carcasses, Maritime Nonsense, so on and so forth. All these earlier works that kind of somehow relate in a similar universe, even though each one of them has a particular accent, but then it's something that becomes a vessel that collects a lot of knowledge, a lot of stories, and in a sense relies on a lot of research. And I think this is something that perhaps it's a good moment to bring this, because the work becomes a conduit towards research and finding this knowledge that is then becoming collective knowledge, or layers and layers of knowledge. Archives become, whether the work itself becomes a vessel for an archive, or archives that underpin the work, the artistic product that ultimately comes out from the research. Perhaps, Zineb, you can talk to us a little bit about the role of archives in your work. You've done a lot of works that rely on looking at different types of archive. Caricatures is one of them. Film, of course, is a very important one, and you've excavated so many film archives and found a lot of things. Maybe we talk a little bit about archive in your work, and what led you to that, and how do you still use the archive as one of those impetus, and an impetus to develop your different projects?
I'm a bit obsessed with the archive, but it's also, I think, because I'm a collector myself. I collect a lot of stuff.
There's a lot of vinyl records in Zineb's house as well, when you go to her living room, so that's another kind of overlap.
I'm somebody who spends a lot of time in flea markets and in bric-a-brac shops and things like that, and I'm always buying vinyls, many, but not books, objects. Of course, I'm interested in a very particular period of time. For me, it's the 50s, 60s, possibly the 70s, because, it ties up with some political interests of that period too. But also it's a period perhaps when I was born in the 60s, and I've been, informed somehow, although I was a child, with a lot of things that was going on there, and hence why my love of the music from the 60s comes from, but not only dressing up also, etc. But so already I'm a collector. I'm a bit of a hoarder collector. I have a lot of stuff, and somehow I'm creating my own archive when I collect. Then there is this idea of making work and researching work, and especially in the context of Algeria, where the archive is very difficult to access, especially for the non-Algerians, for the ones that can't travel there. For me, it was very important when I started making work, looking at archive in Algeria, it's to be able also to have this idea of collecting knowledge, but also of sharing of knowledge, being able to put in my own artworks a lot of the information, a lot of the documents, a lot of the photos, and notably when I did the Jeux de Paume project around the Pan-African Festival of 1969 in Algiers, a lot of people were interested in that moment, but nobody could go to Algeria to get the archive. Of course, you have to rely in France, and so it's the same story. We have to rely in France for the story of Algeria, but this is the way it is. It's also because Algeria is not very good at keeping their own archive. But anyway, I was lucky enough to be able to access those documents. So for me, I had to share those documents with others, and so I did a lot of collages where you have documents, actually literally bits of text sometimes, or press clipping from that period where I was putting in and it was quite interesting because after a lot of people would contact me and say, oh, we're researching that and we don't know where to find it. And I was able to say, well, look at this photo montage or whatever for them too. So it's to do with share of knowledge also. But my love for archive has to do with my love of all things, of all documents. But when I go to an archive, it's not just about reading the text or looking at the photos, it's everything about it. It's the way it's been classified, the folders in which it is placed, the shelves that were built for this type of archive. And you can actually find that in my Venice Biennale, because then I recreated a lot of those aesthetics of the aesthetic of the archive, if you want. And of course, the older the archive is, the more exciting it is. When I go to archives that were super modern, I find it quite
But this is, I think, something maybe somehow connecting to another particular project of yours, Sonia, and I'd love to hear what you think, what you have to say about that. When I think about the project in Venice, that we worked on together, I feel that the whole project was an archival display. You took films, you took sets from films that you had researched, and then you brought them aesthetically, physically, as an archival presentation, but in your own reinterpretation. So you collected this knowledge. And then, Sonia, I think about the women's hair project that you worked on. You collected hair from black women, and then you transform that into an aesthetic object. So there's something going on there where you collect things that are completely perhaps not thought of as a starting point for an artwork, and then you somehow translate it into a completely, whether it's a wallpaper, whether it's a sculpture. So what I think Till and I have always admired about both of your practices is your ability to reinvent the archive. So it's not just about walking into a place and seeing a vitrine with images that you have looked at, but giving them a new life, a new form, so they communicate on a different level. Maybe one question for both of you before I give back to Till, because he's kind of getting a little bit like left out and he wants to talk too, is maybe tell us a little bit about your instinct as an artist. We can start with you, Sonia, and then go back to Zineb. How does the form come to you? You've both worked in such a wide array of forms, whether you've done photographs. When do you feel this needs to be a photograph or a wallpaper or a film or a sculpture? How does that process evolve with you? And I'm sure it's not always the same, but it's good to hear, especially when you're starting from an archival starting point.
I'm remembering, this was before Venice was even on the horizon, coming to your studio in Brixton, and then I had a studio in that same building, and we were looking at, I came to talk to you about what you were doing, and we do have conversations quite often about practice, and I came to your studio, and we were looking at an artist who'd been using records in a sculptural way. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
And
I can't remember the artist.
I can't remember the name of the artist, but I remember that this artist had kind of cut them and reshaped these vinyl records. And I suppose for me, the question about, and I think we probably both are very invested in the materiality of things.
You know, we have two artists who still touch things with their own hands, and that's very, very uncommon.
Is it?
Getting less and less common, perhaps, but you know.
But I do think that I'm remembering that conversation about what this artist had been doing by cutting the record and seeing the possibilities of the materiality of this vinyl record.
I remember who it is now. Shall I say?
Yeah.
Kaponi Kiwanga. The beautiful pieces she did with the salt and the sugar.
Yeah. But that idea that you're taking what you can, whatever you've got, and what can you do with it? So I'm thinking particularly of We Move in Her Way, showing some images here, and there'd been quite a lot of discussion that I'd been involved in the late 90s, early 2000s about performance work and the performance document, and if it's an archival document, is it a secondary document to the actual performance that took place, and thinking, I surely that document can have another life somehow. And so one of the things about doing that particular performance, which was quite anarchic, there was no script, nobody knew what was going to happen, but there was a crew who were just doing their own thing, and I got someone to do stills photography while the performance was unfolding, and then at the end of the process, all that stuff came to me, and it was like, oh, that's a really interesting image, and what can I do with that? And then deciding, maybe that image could become a pattern, and maybe I could make a wallpaper from it, or maybe I can cover an object, I can cover a shape with it, and actually just kind of taking it for a walk, basically.
And you, Zineb, how does the form come to you?
I don't know. I mean, each project is different, but the Venice one was an interesting one because there was a lot of mise en abîme also, but there was also remakes, and there was a making of, and there was the set design who were displayed, and all that. And all those ideas came from all the multiple cinema archives that I visited, notably in Italy, because they're great with the cinematheques. But also me watching films, a lot of films, so trying to pull out a lot of things that I like, or conceptually or aesthetically from each of those archives. and placing. But also there is something about the archive when you go, because there is a whole ritual. It's always very precious. You have to wear gloves, you know. You have to be careful. Sometimes you can take photos, sometimes you can't. Everything is folded nicely, blah, blah. So us as artists, obviously we're lucky because we can actually break that, you know. Obviously we can't break the archive, the documents, but we can take photos of those documents and then be more playful about that. So I kind of really like this idea of breaking the stiffness of the archive, because often they are stiff. Unless you go to a private archive, and then it's completely different. There is a humanity around it, which is very different. So things for me start making sense and place visually in terms of the conversation I have, in terms of a coup de foudre I have for something. And so I can't say it's each time very different. You know, the one I did on the caricature in Algiers was much more classical, you know, so it depends on the, yeah, it depends, but it's very important to understand that we also creating our own archive. I know that Sonia's got tons of boxes in her studio that she still needs to sort out, and one day hopefully she will be, and she will become an archive just, you know, herself. But, you know, talking back about Capuani's in conversation, for me I was shocked that you could have, because I collect a lot of books and very valuable ones, some are becoming more valuable records, like the Angela Davis vinyl of her discourse or whatever. I cannot touch them. I mean, I can show them, but I cannot. No, I can't do that. So this is perhaps the next step where I'll be able to do that. So I'm still kind of very looking at them in that kind of very precious way, and I need to move on from that. But at the same time, for me, it's part of my archive. I can't destroy it. I won't destroy it, but I can display it. So I don't know how you feel about this type of. Sorry, I've taken your place. Question.
Till, how about Till and I? Let's just get down and have the ladies.
I'll ask a difficult question at the end.
Well, actually, I'm reminded of a question that Uriel Orlo, a mutual friend and artist, said to me about the archive. Could you burn it? And I was so shocked at the idea of, you know, that, and then realised, of course, the archive is responsibility, particularly if it's material that actually desperately needs to have a public attention to it. That it is as a thing, it's very. Yeah, it's a responsibility to begin to have a collection. However, part of my reasoning around the memorabilia is, thankfully, in terms of music, and some of the musical items I have are difficult to get hold of, but they were made in their thousands. So my hope is, you know, eternally hopeful that I can find another one if I need to replace it. But also, there are many records and CDs and objects that have not been yet shown. So I have a store of stuff to be used. But I kind of wonder about that. You know, once you start to take on the responsibility of that knowledge, can you trash it? It's like, it feels quite nihilistic.
Well, and magical thing happened. You know, you share a lot of these concerns, friendships and thoughts and archives, communities, everything builds up, and as destiny wanted it, you both ended up doing the pavilions in Venice, the UK pavilion and the French pavilion, who on top of it are actually next to each other in the Giardini. So there you are, being neighbors yet again. And Zineb topped it off. I don't know if it was you know, a question of cheap labor or production of budget. All your friends are in the pavilion, literally. No, I'm joking. So of course, a really important part of the film that all your friends are in it. So Sonia is actually in.
No real artist wanted to work with Zineb, so we had to just improvise.
Exploitation is called exploitation.
Exploitation. But we were actually all in this project, and I think maybe what really was quite remarkable is this connection between the two projects, but your friendships, but also bigger meta questions in many ways. And perhaps starting with Zineb, I mean, one of your things that you say also in the film itself, that was one of the main parts of this pavilion, besides all the film sets, is something about, you know, conflicts rooted or problems or, you know, suicides even rooted in conflicted identities. And there you are now representing France, even though you had lived in the UK for such a long time. And there you are, Sonia, representing a country that maybe also you, as you said in the beginning, you were also maybe struggling to come to terms with in many ways. And you were often quoted as being the first and and all those things. But perhaps, Zineb, what went through your head now representing France as a French Algerian artist living in London? And
At the time or today?
no, now in 2022, because that was something that was often talked about. And how did that influence also your artistic choice? I mean, did you kind of, I think, pack the bull by its horns, so to speak? I mean, there's always this thing of an artist representing a country, which is of course a bit silly, but
yeah, I mean,
I think both of you made something very meaningful and interesting out of that premise.
I mean, it's a difficult space to take on because you represent a country, and already politically it's a bit difficult. But for me, I had to take, because I was the first French black woman, if you want, to represent France. And I had to take, and some people were already arguing at the time that perhaps I shouldn't because the French politics is so racist, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, I feel like I've got to kind of set an example somehow for the next generation. And actually, it's true since then, two other artists of color have been, Julien last year with the French Pavilion, and in 2 years' time, it will be Ito Barada also. So in some ways, it's kind of, it feels quite good to know that
somebody has to be the first one.
Yeah. It was a great challenge and a great budget and a great team to work with. I think it's the first time with the French Pavilion that I've worked with the curators were not brilliant, but that's...
Well, you have to do with what you have.
No, but I had a brilliant curatorial team. I had a brilliant technical team. The French Institute was very good. The budget, it's never enough, but okay, it was the best I had at the time. So I was able to really make a project the dream project. What can I say? I danced, I sung, and all my friends were together, were there, invited, Sonia was in my project because she was in the British Pavilion, but Latif Akshash, who was also representing Switzerland, was also in my film project. So I really pleased myself, and I pushed, I think, aesthetically and artistically, and I hope conceptually, the work as much as I could go. The toughest now is to go beyond that, or So we'll see what will become to the next new production. But for me, it was like a wonderful moment, and I'm very happy with the work I've done, So.
Well, I'm a bit biased, so I can't really comment on it. But Sonia, what about, I think, your project in Venice? I feel having, followed your work for a long time, and also very much felt that continuity, or bringing really who you are as a person and as an artist with all your history and archives into that pavilion. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit also about your experience, or how you... it's completely nerve-wracking, I think, for an artist to have that kind of pressure actually on your back to do this pavilion. I think it's really one of the toughest challenges you have to crack as an artist, with all these eyes and the expectations and the political angles and the weight of doing this national pavilion. It's a really tough nut to crack, and I think you obviously smashed it, So, but how did you, approach it, or what was going on in your mind? What did you want to say?
I think the first thing to say, I'll come to the question about representing nation, in a minute. But the moment I was announced, very soon after, before Zineb was announced before me, and then I was announced, and then straight away we went into lockdown because of COVID, and so there was a very, very peculiar moment of trying to do a social practice where one couldn't meet, and trying to think through how one, it wasn't clear when the next Biennale was going to be, because it skipped a year, because I don't know how you found it, trying to get to Venice and get anything done. It was just incredibly, there was so many different challenges. And I suppose my overriding feeling at the time was, I really want to hear someone sing that kind of, I don't know, comforts me in this moment that is was incredibly challenging and felt everybody seemed very isolated. how to bring people into the same space. And so then felt that the devotional project, and I've done many different projects with different groups of people, was somehow was a kind of solid starting point. Because it's really difficult when you're given this huge space and, okay, do something with this. And the British Pavilion space I thought was quite an awkward space, but anyway. So it was really wanting to have people sing to me, I suppose, was the kind of my gut feeling, the thing that I was going with. And of course, within the devotional project, all of the singers have one foot in the UK and another foot mainly in many other places. And that was very much the point, in a way, to kind of think about how does one talk about nationhood in that kind of monolithic way, when all of these musicians that are in this work, they started their careers, or they became famous through being in the UK, but they are connected to the world in all sorts of ways. So these things were in my mind at the time. And then I got really quite tired of being, Vernissage Week is insanely intense. From 10 in the morning till 7 at night, every 20 minutes I was doing an interview with a journalist. They literally had me in a cupboard, and people would come in, 20 minutes, out, the next one in, out, the next one. And they would all ask me, in the lead up as well, I would always be asked about being the first black British female artist to be representing Britain. What does that feel like? And my
That's why I didn't ask the question that
No,
way.
you
I tried to
didn't ask the
rephrase
question.
it.
But one of the things that question told me was, nobody was expecting you, Sonia.
That's so true.
And that was what that question was about, was you're here. How did you get here? And then when I think about the opening, and I cried a lot. I cried a lot that week.
Oh,
the
yes.
opening.
We know.
But I cried. But I cried because I suddenly felt the weight of history. And I felt the same probably for you, Zineb, the weight of history being literally at the front of this facade of nationhood. And the weight I thought was actually unbearable.
Yeah, but because I think when you're artists dealing with issues like we do, we have to double work harder to be recognized. So when we are recognized, we're like, oh, wow, And in that sense, you winning the Golden Lion and me getting another prize, I mean, really in France, nobody wanted me to. People were expecting me to fail, like they were probably expecting you to fail also, but we didn't somehow. And then, yeah, of course, it feels, I didn't cry as much as you. But yeah, it was a mad moment. And that we again together in that moment when you go and pick up the prizes, it's like...
That was the strangest moment, really, in that room, really.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Perhaps, this is a good moment to also talk about, let's say, the counterforce. There's that weight of history, there's that weight that is because exactly of who you are, where you come from, your skin color, so many associations, your language, your culture. And again, people, being surprised, even though they don't express it directly, that, oh, you've made it so far, how come? While you've worked like any other artist, trying to push the boundaries of your medium, working on every project every day. So perhaps on that note, it might be good to talk about what are the sources from which you draw strength in such moments. We can talk about networks. What are the networks that you kind of go back to kind of refuel when you feel that weight, whether it's the weight of history, whether it's sometimes the expectations, or sometimes even you feel dry, going through a dry spell as an artist. Where do you find that strength? Where do you draw that strength from?
In my case, I believe it's my artistic community, hence why I wanted them to be so present in my Venice project. But the other person, for me, it will always be my father and my mom because of the simplicity and the fact that they're not in the art at all, like your parents. I just find it so rewarding and so rich each time I go and visit them because of the way they speak and the stories they always have to tell. And for me, it's always I come out from them. The other place is Algeria, because I really move between London, Paris, and Algiers. And when I go, I was in Algiers only 6 days ago. And each time I go there, something happens that makes me like think, no, I want to carry on, I will, and my next project will be there. So often it's a place that where I actually find inspiration somehow.
We were extremely lucky to meet both your parents. Unfortunately, your father is not with us anymore, but your mom is going strong. And it was a constant, instant love affair between me and Zineb's mother. She's still looking for a wife for me, but she's amazing. She's really amazing. And I can see how she can give a lot of strength, because what she wants, she will get. Sonia, how about you? Where do you draw your strength from?
Sorry, I just have this image of Zineb's mum looking around thinking, that one.
I get images every other week.
That's really beautiful, actually. So I mean, throughout, actually, I really do rely a lot on other artists, curators, people that are friends, who say, you know, call me up if you need to. I'm just thinking during the whole process, in the lead up to Venice, and while we were in Venice, the people making lunch for us. I think about Ghislaine, who's the director at Whitechapel. People saying, just call if you need to chat, or going to someone's studio, or just going to see a show with someone. So I do rely quite heavily on the artistic community that I'm part of. You know, they are so entwined in my life that I can't. It's sometimes difficult to make a separation.
One of them is not very far. I mean, you live with someone and you're married to someone who is from the artist community.
Who's very much part of the artistic community. So there's that. And of course, you know, the family is the kind of humorous leveler in terms of, you know, but you still got to go and do the shopping at the supermarket, you know, you may have all those awards, but, you know, could you just sort out dinner? And for that is really leveling. It's like, okay, and that I did really need to do after Venice, was just come back to myself and come back to the things that are just who I am on a day-to-day level. And actually, it's me on the day-to-day level that makes little tiny imaginative leaps. And while you were talking, I was thinking there's a saying that I think there's an arts organisation in Amsterdam called this. If I can't dance, I don't want to be at your revolution. And I just think that for me, that idea of just people that you could dance with, that you could have a laugh with, that you could, that is where I'm happy.
Well, perhaps the final question, we spoke also indirectly already about music and how important that is, but I think there is and I think that's very evident in both of your work and both of your practices, but I think there's another commonality we feel that is perhaps not as obvious, and that is maybe something connected to motherhood, being a mother, or the relationship to your own mothers in the work. And you both are mothers of beautiful children, and again, Zineb, of course, you know, employed one of her sons in the Venice project, so is the actor who's actually standing behind the bar. But perhaps you can talk a little bit about the importance of being a mother in connection also to your artistic work, and how do you think maybe that impacts, or does it change, or what does it mean being a mother and an artist in your projects? Perhaps maybe Sonia, you can start.
I'm very happy I could talk all day about this, actually. So one of the things that I was doing in the 90s with my partner, and we both co-parent and take that responsibility really seriously. We were both as in a job share running the African and Asian Visual Artist Archive. Sorry, I will get to the point, but so we would be open for, it was a slide library, it was an artist slide library basically, and people would come and do research. And a young man came in, he was in his 20s, and I've forgotten his name, but he says, oh yeah, I'm Susan Hiller's son. People here may know who Susan Hiller, the artist.
Yes.
And I'd known Susan Hiller since I was at art school. She came and taught me. And I never knew she had a son. And I was so freaked out by this that I'd known her for 20-something years, 30 years possibly. And I never knew that she had a son.
Gabriel.
And basically she said, well, you know, in the 70s, if you're a woman artist and you said you had a child, that would kill your career. And so, you know, this question about actively saying, yes, I'm an artist and I'm a mother and I'm tied to my family relationships. You know, one of my really good friends, curator during the 90s, was trying to get me to move to Berlin. And I was saying, I can't leave because my mum lives down the road and my sister has moved closer so that we're 10 minutes either side, that we can look after her. And I really love that relationship that we have, which the art world doesn't always recognize, that actually familial ties are not something to hide, but something that actually can feed somehow. So.
Beautiful.
Yeah, well, motherhood. I mean, as opposed to you, Sonia, I was a single mother for many years. So I was doing a lot of looking after the kids. That doesn't mean the father wasn't around. I was doing a lot of looking after the children on my own, plus making the artwork, plus trying to find, you know, some money to... So that was tough. But, you know, at the end of the day, I believe sometimes when you're in a situation where it's so difficult and you love what you're doing, obviously I love being a mother, I had 3 children, so... is that you just keep at it, you just kind of fight for it, and that's it. And of course, I also created a community, my artistic community, was also a community. We were in a generation, we were all having children more or less. So my son will play with Sonia's daughter, Maya, and we will help each other with babysitting. We will meet sometime at the 1 o'clock club with David. So of course, you build also a kind of a community of friends or artists who have children, and you can share. You know, but of course, we could never do the residency projects that many artists were doing. So a lot of things were taken away from you if you had a child, and especially if you were on your own like mine. But you know, I don't see it as a sacrifice or I've suffered from it, because I think it gave me la hargne, like the French say. You know, it gave me that thing of thinking, okay, I'm still gonna carry on with art, and whatever happened. So, you know, and the children also became, and
Yeah,
that's
like
why
mother
they,
tongue,
artwork,
and when you work mother tongue, which actually relates to your mom and your daughter.
Yeah, they were part of my artwork. So, you know, unlike Susan Hiller, I didn't have to hide it, and I didn't hide it because I was making work about being a mother, you know, and and what happened. But it is a lot of, often I get this question as an artist, being a mother, children, how did I do it? How was it possible? And I can never find a direct response to that, because you just do it, you know.
And it's still the same struggle, in fact.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of people that are mothers in particular, or parenting and trying to make ends meet, and that's, I think, a struggle that is completely not recognized even nowadays, of being not allowed to go to artist residency programs, etc., or not getting these stipends. It's still a major topic, I think.
We know so many artists who became mother and who disappeared, you know, in the art.
Because of motherhood, exactly.
Yeah, because of them, yeah.
So many of them.
Good.
Well, I guess we can continue doing this for a long time, because you're both wonderful in terms of the stories that you have lived and the stories that you tell. And motherhood is probably something that we can all connect with. At the moment, we also have an exhibition that we just opened this week for a wonderful opera singer and painter who was here in Berlin in the 30s, Samiha Bergso. In the first painting you see, and one of the most important figures in her life and work was her mother. And I guess this is something that bring our feet back, to the reality that there's all that we do in our artwork and our art life, but family and motherhood and these relationships are also this fuel that keeps us in check. Yes, Sonia.
Can I just add to that?
Please.
I mean, one of the things that has been really important to me throughout my entire artistic career is my art mothers. My art mothers. The women artists that I'm constantly are saying, yes, and there is a history and there's a genealogy, and that within the field, we have our art mothers as well.
Thank you so much.